for coming. I'd like to apologize for the title. I guess it seemed funny at the time, but we can move on from that now. So this presentation will be about the fundamentals, and I hope it doesn't come across as too basic. I really wanted to get everybody up to speed where we were with Easy Proxy. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is kind of come from the perspective of acquiring a new resource, setting up authentication with the vendor, and activating the resource in Alma specifically, which might be a little bit odd since GALILEO is the support unit that's handling all the activations at the moment. But I think this will help with understanding with what's going on behind the scenes with OpenAthens. I'm not going to do a step-by-step instructions necessarily, but I'm going to hit on all the high concepts for understanding how resources authenticate through OpenAthens and how this translates into enabling OpenAthens on resources in Alma. I won't get too deep in the woods. Like I said, the reason is that we're still your single point of contact. GALILEO support is. We've taken on this over the past year because we're still in the process of migrating all of our institutions to OpenAthens, and it's also a way for us to vet all the issues with the wide gamut of vendors that our institutions subscribe to. And we're using our working relationship with OpenAthens to try to improve vendors' implementation of OpenAthens, which can vary quite a bit. For I guess all of you all have been through the OpenAthens migration. And so Easy Proxy has been the primary means of remote authentication for vendors for the past, it's almost 2 decades now, which was a lot easier to set up. OpenAthens is more complicated, and I'm not trying to undersell OpenAthens, but I think the goal of this presentation is just to bring our up to where it was with Easy Proxy. So, like I said, I'm going to start, from the perspective of setting up resources and just kind of walk through things from that perspective. So when you acquire a new resource, I guess the first question to ask is this, available on a platform that's already been set up with OpenAthens? OpenAthens is usually set up at the platform level with publishers or database vendors rather than the collection or resource level. So if you acquire a new collection, there's a good chance that, if you have a vendor, it's from a vendor that you've already have subscribed to other collections in the past, then it's been set up with OpenAthens. ProQuest and EBSCO are great examples of this. If you have OpenAthens set up on the EBSCO platform, then you're good to go when you acquire new databases. So no new configurations are needed. Just keep in mind that some publishers do have multiple platforms. Oxford is a good example of this. Their Oxford, I think it's called Oxford Reference Collections, that is different than their academic journals. So you're going to actually have 2 different connections set up for that. And Taylor and Francis is another example. Their journals are separate from their ebook platform. 2 different OpenAthens connections will be needed for those. And I guess a way of knowing this is that the URLs used for those are completely different domains. And this next slide shows that. So example is ProQuest. You can see the domains are identical. And then for Oxford, you have academic journals, which is completely separate from their university press, which is, I guess, Oxford Reference. And so the most powerful item in answer to these questions is, I should have mentioned also that the second point is, is the resource in the OpenAthens Federation, or does it need to be proxied through OpenAthens proxy service? And I'll get into the details of how to determine that in a bit. So like I was about to say, the most powerful item in answer to these questions is the vendor URL. As you can see here, as an example. So we'll go into the OpenAthens admin. This is where you activate your resources in OpenAthens, and where the connection to the institution's local directory is maintained It's also where you can add hosted users, which are the users that do not reside in your local directory. You're adding them in the OpenAthens admin, and it's usually a special cases where you have special groups that aren't part of your campus IDP. So you're providing a way to access your resources through OpenAthens admin. And right now, the admin only offers a single login for institutions for all staff, which is not a great experience. OpenAthens is redeveloping the admin as we speak, and it will allow multiple staff logins. But right now, we're having to just provide one login for everybody. The current admin is pretty old, and it was developed a long time ago around a product called myopenathens.net, which is basically a database's A to Z list that we don't really necessarily point our users to. And they're redeveloping things as we speak, like I said, and it's kind of centered around resource activation, and it'll be a much better user experience than the current admin. And what I want to focus on now is the redirector link generator. This is the part of the admin that generates OpenAthens links, which is a process of OpenAthens redirector URL to the vendor URL. And with this, the vendor URL gets percent encoded, which is a requirement for OpenAthens authentication. That's different from Easy Proxy. It offers you the ability to load, let's do this little here, see. It offers you the ability to, there we go, to bulk load multiple URLs if you have a bunch of vendor URLs for individual collections or even individual titles. You can put them into a CSV formatted file, import them in, and you will get a batch export of all of your OpenAthens URLs. It's also a way to, one second. It's also a way to find resources in your OpenAthens catalog. And that's kind of the primary thing I want to show you today with the redirector link generator. OpenAthens does have a search for your resources in your catalog. I find this to be a little bit clumsy. As you can see, I searched for Oxford up here, and it's resulted in multiple entries. And if you're looking for something like Oxford Academic, which is their academic journals, you might not know which card is the appropriate card for that that resource. Sorry, I keep jumping back and forth. So what I prefer to do is to take the URL that you've received from the vendor and plug it into the redirector link generator. And from there, let me get to this. You have this right here. Let me get to the. So once you plug the URL in, you have a link, and this will take you directly to the appropriate card. So once you've clicked on that link, you are taken to the card for academic Oxford academic journals. And at this point, to determine whether you actually have access to this or it's already been set up in OpenAthens, you'll see this in blue. This means it has been allocated. If you see it in green, then that means it has not been allocated yet, hasn't been set up. And I'm sure if you just acquired a new resource like Oxford academic journals, you probably were already aware of whether it's been set up or not. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Sorry. And then the next example. So that's the example of a federated resource searching that with using the redirector link generator. Another example is when you plug in the vendor URL and you get an error. And this error that you're seeing right here is a generic error. It seems like it's pretty specific.
Ken, can you unmute yourself? And now I don't hear it. Well, you muted yourself. Let's give Ken a chance to get back with us. I don't know what the sound was. So odd. I think Ken is, oh, hold on. Give me a second. Let's see. Ken, are you back with us? Ken, are you back with us? Let me look in the chat. It's showing my mic is unmuted. Okay. Ken can hear me. Okay. Okay, maybe try, because I don't know if anyone else was hearing what sounded like a TV screen going shh. If you were hearing that, let me know. I'm just trying to gauge if it was just me or if everyone could hear that.
Hey, Joy, this is Mike. I heard it too.
Okay. Okay, everyone heard it. Okay. So I'm not sure what's going on. Ken, if you can unmute yourself, I just want to see if it happens again. And if it does, we will have Ken log off and log back in. I'm also seeing some sort of staticky something on the screen. That is so odd. Never seen that before. Let's see. Yeah, Ken's logging out and logging back in. So you guys see the static too? That's so weird. Okay. I think something actually may be going on with Teams. Do you hear the static when I'm talking? No. Okay. So Doug Carlson, you're on. I'm not certain, but if your camera might be on, you could be sure to turn it off. Hi, Doug. Is your camera on? It is off. That's so weird. Okay, something weird, always something new. You learn every day about Microsoft Teams. Let's see if Ken is back. I hate to have everybody like hang up and start over. That would be frustrating. Okay, Ken is back. Let's see. Ken, can you unmute yourself? Ken's leaving again and coming back. So we may have to have me bring up the presentation and then Ken to call in. So just give us give us a second. I'm going to bring the presentation up where Ken was. All right, I'm going to share from my screen. Browse, upload, GUGM, open. So Ken, I'm bringing up your presentation. If you want to try to unmute yourself and try again, if this doesn't work, I will just suggest for you to call in, but let's double check and see if we can hear you. It shows Ken as muted. Well, everyone's muted. Ken can unmute himself. Okay, so Ken, are you trying to unmute yourself? Okay, so yes, just call in and then I will move the presentation. Sorry, everyone. I swear we went over this yesterday, but you never know. Things happen. Thank you guys for hanging in there. Okay. Give me a second.
All right. Hey, all right.
Yeah, and tell
Hold on. All right. Okay.
All right. Is this the page you're on?
So I'm gonna share my screen and just do it that way.
Okay. Okay.
All right. Yeah, it was when I called in, it was saying I was still muted as well, but it gave me the option to unmute. So yeah, I guess in my browser or in my Teams I was seeing I was unmuted. But anyway,
We're back. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks. That was a lot of fun. Not even sure where I was. So I guess this example is that we're showing, you've plugged in a vendor URL and you're getting an error. That seems to be specific to deep linking, and we'll say that's a very generic error message. It actually most likely means that this resource has not been set up, and it will most likely need to be set up as as an OpenAthens proxy service resource. And the other possibility is that it could be a federated resource and you just have a outdated URL. In that case, you'll need to consult with the vendor, make sure you have the most current URL. You can also plug that URL in a browser and see if it redirects to maybe the current platform for that, the current URL for their platform that they support. And so that brings me to there's my slides. Yeah, there we go. To the OpenAthens proxy service. I'm about to go through the two ways that you can authenticate through OpenAthens. One is through their proxy service, and the other is a federated access. OpenAthens does offer a proxy service, and it's much like Easy Proxy. You simply register your proxy IP with a vendor, and then on OpenAthens, and they configure the stanza for that resource to allow authentication through OpenAthens. And they maintain all the configurations for each resource. In the past, institutions had their local version of Easy Proxy where they had to add the stanzas and maintain that, as well as Galileo having an instance of Easy Proxy for each institution. So we had to maintain that locally as well. And that's all done by OpenAthens at this point. The one drawback with IP proxy authentication with OpenAthens, and this is true with Easy Proxy, is that it doesn't allow any ability for personalization at vendors. So as I'll mention with Federated access, when you authenticate into vendor platforms that offer personalized folders, you can authenticate with OpenAthens Federated access and have a direct connection and log in once and have access to your personal folders, whereas IP authentication, you're not going to have that. And like Federated access, the OpenAthens proxy service, it also uses the OpenAthens Redirector URL. There's no distinction between proxy authentication and Federated authentication in terms of what URLs you use. And I'll go deeper into the Redirector URL in a bit. Federated access, you will find these resources, and I say it, you'll find all these resources in the catalog, which is 98 to 99% true. There are a couple of outliers that will require a different kind of intervention to get those set up. But if you have the current URL for a federated resource and you plug it into the link generator, like I showed you before, you will find that in the catalog, the resource card in the catalog in OpenAthens. To set up federated access with the vendors, you typically, exclusively you need the OpenAthens Federated Entity ID, and that's, I'm using an example here for Kennesaw. The second item that's typical for them to need is the organization ID. And in some cases, vendors require a scope. And the scope is typically used for institutions that have multiple campuses, so they can identify the different campuses with different scopes. But like I said, if you have a one-to-one relationship with just your one institution campus and your vendor, then you most likely just need the Federated Entity ID and your organization ID. And like I mentioned before, with Federated access, you can, it does offer the ability for personalization with vendors. So, with EBSCO, if you log into your OpenAthens, then it basically is going to log you into your EBSCO folder. And unlike proxy access, there are publishers and most of our vendors out there like EBSCO, ProQuest, Science Direct, Oxford, all those major platforms. They offer a way to log into OpenAthens when you're coming from the World Wide Web. So if you're just hitting the vendor link without any authentication tied to it, a lot of those vendors offer a way to search for your institution, and once you've done that, then it'll prompt you for an OpenAthens login. So the main component of OpenAthens authentication is the redirector URL here. This, like I said before, this is used for federated and proxy resources. And based on how it's set up in OpenAthens, it will send you through the federated access or proxy authentication. Another component of OpenAthens that's not true for Easy Proxy is that the vendor URL that comes after the OpenAthens redirect URL has to be % encoded, which does complicate some things. And then there's also some of these vendors that I've mentioned so far do require the OpenAthens redirector URL to be prepended to the vendor URL, but there's a lot of vendors that are not a lot. There's a handful of vendors that don't require this, and I'll go into those in a bit. So here is the redirector URL authentication path. This is not really going over whether, it's not like a flow chart of whether you're authenticated or not. It's basically just showing you have a OpenAthens redirector URL pre-printed to an encoded vendor URL. That sends the users to OpenAthens, and at that point, OpenAthens looks over to the local directory that's been connected, and that's your institution's local directory, and checks to see whether the user is valid. At that point, it goes back to OpenAthens, and it sees how the resource has been set up, whether it's federated or proxied. If it's federated, then it sends you to the federated platform. Proxied, it basically is coming over as an IP-based user. With federated, it gives you opportunity to, like I said, for personalization, you can send over attributes, which direct specific user is coming through, whereas proxies, it's just basically saying you're from institution A. Okay. So the redirector URL, if you're using vendor URLs in your database's A to Z list, and this is, if you have libguides and you're not taking advantage of GALILEO Express, and you just want to put a vendor URL on your site, you will have to run it through the OpenAthens link redirector or link generator. And this is an example for Oxford academic journals. As you can see, it has the OpenAthens redirector URL, and it also has the vendor URL encoded following that. The places where you actually would not employ the OpenAthens redirector or directly or append it, I guess, directly to the vendor URL is in Galileo's GRI program. This is where you have your local resources added to the Galileo database's A to Z list. Basically, our system in the back, if you have enabled OpenAthens in the record for that database, then our system is going to prepend the OpenAthens redirector URL for your institution and % encode the vendor URL. So an example, this is bullet number 2. You will just simply use this baseline. Get here. Sorry, my mouse doesn't work either now. Nothing's working. You'll basically plug in the vendor URL as is, and you won't need the OpenAthens redirector. That is configured on our end. And then GALILEO Express links, if you're using those in your database's A to Z list, then you don't need to prepend the redirector URL to that as well. Alma's integration profile, I'm about to go into this. This is the equivalent of when you have this enabled in Alma, it's the equivalent of running a vendor URL through the OpenAthens redirector link generator. And we're having more technical problems here. Okay, there we go. All right. Apologies. Okay. So in Alma, this is a screenshot of the Alma configuration. The redirector URL is registered in the Proxy Resolver integration profile, and this is in Alma's general configuration. The term Proxy Resolver is just kind of a generic term that Alma uses. It's kind of misleading because the redirector URL is basically the prefix for federated resources and proxy resources alike. So it's not. It might imply that that it's going through OpenAthens proxy, but it's not. It just depends on how the resource is set up in OpenAthens, which determines whether it's proxied or federated. And so, one second. So when you're setting up a resource that's been activated, when you're enabling authentication at the service level, and this is a screenshot at the service level, and you see OpenAthens here. This is what has been configured in the Alma configuration here. So as you can see, that's the redirector URL. And so when this has been enabled on the service, it's basically sending this. This is the Oxford Academic Journals URL. It's going to percent encode that and pre-append the redirector URL to that. Okay, so here is a section where I talk about the vendors that have integrated OpenAthens in their system, a little bit different from what I've shown you so far. Oxford and smaller publishers that basically just have a single domain. All of those URLs just basically require the OpenAthens redirector in front of it with the vendor URL percent encoded following it. EBSCO, Ebook Central, ProQuest, and Gale, they are a bit different. I'll start with EBSCO. All of these URLs, and this is not unlike Easy Proxy. All of these URLs require an account identifier for it to work with OpenAthens, and I highlighted this in red. But for EBSCO, in addition to this, they need authentication type. In this case, it equals IP and shibboleth. And shibboleth is the middleware that is used for OpenAthens authentication. And that will this alone, this actually doesn't need the redirector URL prepended to it. For these vendors, for EBSCO, having these two items here, the cust ID and the authentication type, is enough for it to work for OpenAthens. You can run this URL through the OpenAthens redirector and prepend the OpenAthens redirector URL to it. It'll work just fine, but it's not required. And the same is true for Ebook Central, ProQuest, and Gale. They don't require this authentication type. This is unique to EBSCO. Ebook Central, ProQuest, and Gale, they just simply need your account identifier, and that's enough for them to know that you're, if OpenAthens has been set up with them, of course, that's enough for them to know to prompt users for OpenAthens authentication. Like I said, you can apply the redirector URL to these, but it's just not necessary. And so I'm going to show you how this applies to collections in Alma. The example I showed you before with Oxford, you just simply needed the, let me change this to, you just needed this, what they call a proxy enabled, set to yes, and then to OpenAthens. For vendors like Gale, Ebook Central, well, this is a Gale example here. As you can see, with the Gale URL and the account identifier, it has to exist in the linking parameters. In this case, they call it a location ID, and this was true for Easy Proxy. The thing that's different about this, from Easy Proxy is that this here is enough for OpenAthens authentication to be employed when users click on the Gale title in Primo. You can also turn on the OpenAthens redirector and apply that URL, but it's just not necessary. And it's just the same as it is outside of Alma with just this link right here. And these are just more examples here. So, Ebook Central, hope Georgia Southern doesn't mind me using their account IDs. So you're taking that account ID, you're adding it to the linking parameters, and you don't necessarily need OpenAthens enabled, the redirector enabled. And then EBSCO, it's a little more complicated. And it might be due to EBSCO and Henslee versus relationship, I'm not sure. Their way of authenticating or I guess configuring OpenAthens authentication on EBSCO collections in Alma has changed over the past year. And it's been a little bit frustrating, but I think we've gotten things kind of worked out. EBSCO requires a lot more linking parameters than just the account ID. And that's, because EBSCO's URL needs this authentication type as well. So there's a linking parameter for this authentication type here. In this example, I'm using Kennesaw State. They decided to go live with their OpenAthens without any IP authentication. So their desired user path is for campus and off-campus users to have to log in through OpenAthens alike. So in this case, you don't enable the redirector. EBSCO is unusual. This would actually cause it to fail if you have shibboleth enabled. So in this case, we have yes leaking parameter for shibboleth, which will employ, OpenAthens authentication for off-campus. You also need their customer ID. And since they're not using IP authentication, this is left blank. If for institutions that do use IP authentication, this would have the parameter of yes. So in this case, this URL that I'm showing here doesn't quite match this configuration. I'll do this number right here. So since that is blank, that should be crossed out. Been waiting to do that all day. All right, well, done. Okay, so I jumped off that pretty quick. But that sums up, so, just to kind of sum up Alma, the different ways that OpenAthens can be configured. You have the publishers that just require a simple enabling of the OpenAthens redirector, which is configured here, and then also here. And then there's other vendors like EBSCO, ProQuest, Ebook Central, and Gale that require the authentication to be enabled primarily in the linking parameters here. And so now I'm going to go back to, into the vendor platforms, and we're going to continue to talk about these 4 vendors here. So for Ebook Central, their persistent linking works the same, and all of these vendors have chosen to not employ the OpenAthens redirector on these persistent links for specific titles in their platforms, which might be confusing, especially if you're coming from Easy Proxy, whereas all the persistent links had Easy Proxy appended to the vendor URLs. So it might not look like authentication is going to work off campus just by looking at these, but it does. So this is Ebook Central. We have, not good at that. I'll just do laser. You have the account ID here, which is what Ebook Central calls the channel name. That existing in the URL is enough for remote authentication through OpenAthens. The same is true for ProQuest. You have your account identifier here at the URL, and that's all that's needed. Easy Proxy, you register that in the ProQuest admin and it prepend to the URL, whereas in OpenAthens for ProQuest, you actually you completely remove the proxy setting in the admin, so you don't have any kind of redirector on the URL here. And then EBSCO, we've kind of looked at this enough, but the permalink in EBSCO looks just like the one I showed you before. It has the customer account ID, and then it also has the authentication type, IP, comma shibboleth. So a vendor like Alexander Street Press or Films on Demand, since they do require the OpenAthens redirector, all of their persistent links that exist for titles will have the OpenAthens redirector appended to it. And there are a handful of vendors that didn't offer percent encoding, which is required, as I mentioned before, for the vendor URL. We've worked through, I think, most of those to get them to adapt their system to allow that type of linking. All right, so this is I kind of think of it as a completely different section of the presentation. So during the OpenAthens migration, working with institutions' Alma collections, I did come across a lot of inconsistencies with how collections were set up. And I just kind of want to take a little moment to maybe kind of get us all on the same page, because I think it's just not clear on some of the settings at the collection level, what they're actually doing. And so this is just a section just to kind of provide some clarity on that. So the first question, when you activate a new collection in Alma is whether you want the collection to be discoverable in Primo. And what I mean by that is the actual collection level, not so much the title. So if you've activated a collection, let's just say, research library by ProQuest, the title nature resides in that collection, I think. And if you've activated the collection, then you can search nature and then get a link to research library by ProQuest. But what this is talking about here is whether you want your users to go to Primo and search for research library in the GILFIND/Primo search box. They have the opportunity to search and find that collection and then link out to the collection. By default, when we went to Alma, 4 years ago, we basically decided to, keep the collection suppressed, to kind of delineate, a database's A to Z from the Primo search, which is, getting, at the title level. And that's, it's definitely a decision that can be made by institutions independent of what the consortium is doing in the network zone. And I did see some, variations when going through people's catalogs. So, and then there's some situations where it looked like there was an attempt to make the collection available in Primo, but some settings weren't quite there. So I want to go through that. The bib records are suppressed by default when you activate a collection in Alma. And so they can be unsuppressed at the time of activation, and there is a way to unsuppress them after you've activated them. So here is an example of the kind of activation wizard. Once you've found your collection in the community zone and you've selected activate, the first screen you get to is this right here. So you have the option of changing the public name and then adding a collection level URL. So this is a URL that's going to land on the collection page and not an individual title. But as you can see, by default, it is suppressed. So this has been enabled. So at this point, you have the opportunity to unsuppress this and then add a collection level URL. So you have two options. If it's an EBSCO collection, you simply can't just add an EBSCO URL without your cust ID or the authentication type, and then enable the redirector like you could with Oxford. So if I had Oxford, or let's just say JSTOR right here, this URL right here is the default. So you only need to unsuppress the bib record and then select yes, and then the authentication. But for EBSCO, ProQuest Essential and ProQuest and Gale, you would actually have to add your own custom URL that includes the linking parameter of, the account ID for those vendors for it to work. And so once you've activated the collection, and let's say you did not unsuppress the record, this is what, if you go into the collection level, this is what you're going to see here. This little crossed out eyeball thing indicates at the level that the record has been suppressed and is not discoverable in Primo, which is the default. So if you opted if you didn't opt to unsuppress the record, and you still see this crossed out eyeball, even if you add the collection level URL and you enable authentication, it's not going to do anything. if users search, journals at Ovid complete and Primo, they're still not going to get anything because this has been suppressed. So at the point of activation, if you like I said, you just simply uncheck this, and then depending on the vendor and their URL requirements for authentication, you will either add a URL here, or you will enable OpenAthens Redirector authentication for like resources like JSTOR. But if you don't add the URL, this is I guess the kind of the last point about this is that if you've unsuppressed the record and you don't actually add a URL, it's still not going to display in Primo. So Primo requires two items to be checked here. So the record has to be unsuppressed, and there has to be a URL here. Otherwise, it just will not display, which is good, because if it's not a URL, they're not going to have a way to authenticate into the collection. And so in this example, I've added this Ovid URL here, and I've enabled the OpenAthens Redirector. That's what I call it here. And Ovid is a vendor that doesn't require any kind of linking parameters or account ID in their URL. And so if you've activated a collection and you didn't unsuppress the record, and then you decide later that you would like that collection to appear in Primo, you do have the option to go into the bib record and edit. By default, you'll see this suppressed from discovery. You just simply have to uncheck this, but it is going to require a publishing job to do that, and so that will be performed by GALILEO or GIL. So you'll have to contact us on that. So you might want to make some decisions about what collections you want to appear in Primo or don't, and maybe get a list of collections that you want to work with. If you want to retroactively make them available and Primo. And so that was just kind of something I just wanted to add on to the bit about OpenAthens. I'm hoping that is useful. Well, we got through that pretty quick. I guess we have plenty of time for questions, so I'm happy to open up a browser. If there's anything that we'd like to work through, we could use this as kind of a little bit of a workshop, if you'd like.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask them, or you can put them in the chat. Marie says this was very helpful. I'm not seeing any questions come in, and I'm not seeing any additional questions in the chat. So if that is everything, afterwards, if you all do find that you have questions, you can email us at GALILEO. I'm sure everyone knows how to reach Ken through our support services form on the website. And this presentation, having been recorded, will be available for you all to view later. And his presentation slides will also be made available to you all as well. So I just want to thank Ken for doing this presentation this morning. And thank you all for joining us and bearing with us as we worked through some of those technical difficulties earlier. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you all so much. Bye.